Welcome back, good people, for another Midnight Mirage Red Stick Family History lesson. And it is your host, Blackbeard. And I just want to thank you for tuning in, supporting the channel, and supporting my videos. And for those that have purchased the Midnight Mirage books, I want to thank you as well. And for those that will purchase it on a future date. So in this episode, we will talk about the fall of Swarthy Europa and rise of the Slavic Caucasian class of Europa. Okay. Unfortunately, in this country, the United States of America, whether you are a melanated Aboriginal person and American, or if you're a foreign Caucasian United States citizen, both of us have been misled and lied to when it comes to true history. From the school system, from public education, elementary, middle, and high school, even into college, we were given false information on a lot of historical events. And in particular, what was going on in Europa and in America before, we'll say, the installation of the so-called United States in the late 1700s. So no matter if a person is a Caucasian or a so-called Black American, you will see a little bit of cognitive dissonance and ignorance when it comes to trying to have conversations and commentary on history. Now, when it came to the rewriting of history, the history that was given to melanated Americans served a particular purpose, and the history that was given to foreign Caucasian citizens of the United States was given to them for a particular purpose. The history that was given to melanated Americans was meant to cause confusion, was meant to make it hard to reverse engineer or trace, their true ethnic national origin. And with this caused a lot of low self-esteem. It causes a lot of insecurities, and it also causes a lack of culture. So that's one of the main primary problems that so-called Black Americans have. It's a lack of cultural understanding, cultural identity. Because whenever I think of the word culture, culture is basically a glue that ties people together. So we all come from different ethnic national backgrounds, but the way of life, the lifestyles, aka the cultures that are created from these ethnic national lifestyles, is how we all identify with each other. And the way you identify with another person that's from your same ethnic national group, it creates some type of a loyalty, it creates integrity, it creates pride, and it glues the people together. Okay. So that is one of the greatest sins that was done to so-called Black Americans or melanated American people, was having their culture removed and a lot of their true history, because we really don't have a way to identify with each other. We all can't agree on what our real history is, etc. So when I look at some of the problems that plague our people, to me personally, that's the primary one. It's the lack of cultural understanding, because the culture is what glues the people together. For example, let's take the people right now that are in Palestine dealing with colonial occupation from Caucasian Europeans. Although they may be in poverty, although they may not have a strong military and have certain resources that the West has, but because they have their cultural identity and their religion intact, they can identify with each other and they can stick together and fight against the oppression. Whereas here in the West, the melanated Americans, we do not have that culture that can glue us together. Whatever our original, let's say, spirituality was, a lot of that has been lost. And this makes it very easy for us to be disloyal to each other. It makes it very, very easy for us to sabotage each other. Okay. So as far as the false historical narratives, that's why it was promoted to us that way, to cause disruption and disunity, and to weaken the fabric and the glue that ties us together as a culture of people or a group of people. When it comes to foreign Caucasian United States citizens, they were given a false history for a different reason. They were given a false history to create a false sense of superiority, to create a artificial sense of high self-esteem, by giving them historical narratives that make them look better than they really are, and to make them look like they were in a more prominent position in the ancient world, the medieval world, and they were always up. Okay. So they were given a false history more so to create a false sense of high self-esteem, whereas so-called Black Americans were given a false history to create a sense of low self-esteem. All right. And we see that with a lot of Caucasian United States citizens. They think that they were the original people of Greece or the Southern Mediterranean. They think that they were the original people of Rome. And they also think that they were the original settlers of Europa. and during the medieval period that they had power and sway, and rule, excuse me. But unfortunately, that's just not true. Okay. So that is, somewhat of the prelude to understand that the historical narratives and the lies that were given, they were given for different reasons. So depending on what your ethnic national background is, now you have a little bit of a better understanding of why you were severely lied to and misled. So when you're dealing with United States citizens and American citizens, just keep that in mind, that there is going to be cognitive dissonance. There is going to be a lot of, trying to fight against the truth that's coming out. And that's all understandable, because like I said, the people have been severely misled and deceived. All right. So we want to talk about a little bit of the fall of Swarthy Europa and how when the swarthy Moorish people of Europa started to lose power, that were middle class and upper class citizens, the aristocracy, the nobility, when they started to lose power, how this allowed the Slavic Caucasian classes, who were actually the serfs during the feudal system, to rise up. Okay. Remember that melanated people, whether it was in the Americas or Europa, we have a perpetual ancient problem of fighting each other and having civil wars or a lot of infighting. So when you think about the fall of Swarthy Europa, keep this in mind, okay, that you had melanated people fighting against each other. But a strategy that melanated people would use is fighting via proxy, meaning that a lot of the Caucasian serfs that worked for them on their, farms and during the feudal system, they will arm some of these Caucasian men and send them in to fight on behalf of whatever melanated nobility that was financing them at the time. And I talk about this a lot more in my book, America, Moorish Paradise of the Plumed Serpent. So hit me up in the email so you can get the full context. But just real briefly, that's where your Freemasonic system comes from, what's called a freed and accepted Masonic system. Okay. The people that were freed and accepted were the pale Slavic Caucasians that were on the feudal system in Europe. Okay. So you would have had some kind of melanated aristocrat or nobleman or noblewoman. And let's say they were trying to fight and steal land or territory or power or resources from some other melanated people in Europe. What they would do was that they would, of course, send their own melanated knights to go out and fight. But they also would send out certain Slavic Caucasians who were under their rulership that lived on their land. OK, that they served as lords over. So you know how we have that term today, a landlord, the person that actually owns the land or owns the asset that one may be renting, the tenant. And you pay this landlord rent every month. That system goes back to medieval Europa, where the original landlords were the swarthy Europeans or the swarthy Europans. And the people that had to pay them rent and that were the tenants were the Slavic pale Caucasians that lived in Western Europe, that actually migrated to Western Europe from Central Asia. OK, so although they actually are not Caucasians, because believe it or not, pale WIGHTS people are not indigenous to any continent, and they didn't, create any civilization. But the reason why we call them Caucasian is because their ancestry comes from some of the mutated Dravidians, or people coming from that northern India area that settled in what we call modern day Central Asia. And through years and years and years of them being there, that created what we know of as the modern day Caucasian person. And also there was an amalgamation or a mixing with the Neanderthal or the troglodyte of that region. All right. So that's where the original Caucasian comes from. But when it came into Europa, they actually were running into a lot of the melanated indigenous inhabitants that were already in Europa. OK, so, as I was saying, when you had melanated people fighting against each other, they did tend to have a tendency in Europa, rather, to use these Caucasians to fight against each other. All right. So in a lot of these revolutions that happened in Europa, when land was lost, a lot of the Caucasians were allowed to move in, and they began to pay rent to whatever melanated, nobleman or aristocratic family that supported that revolution. All right. So what I'm going to do right now is read from a good, source. It's a page on Facebook I like. It's called Knowledge of Self 2. But it puts out some good images and some good information on history. So we're going to use this to supplement a lot of what I'm talking about in the book. And we're going to talk about the gentleman on the screen right here. All right. So So let's read a little bit about it. And also, let me say this too. Until, melanated American people, we start financing our own research, our own genealogical programs, etc., our own archaeological programs. You gotta be patient with yourself, because a lot of the pictures in history, we also trying to match who are some of these people that we seeing on these pictures. You got a lot of these thumbnails that we use on YouTube or for wallpapers that show these melanated people of, power from America and in Europe. But remember, we still are doing the research to figure out actually who these people are, because part of the historical narrative was to paint these people Caucasian or pale and make their image look different. All right. So what we know is that although we may not have specific pictures of who these people were, we know that their ethnic national character was of a swarthy complexion. All right. And, fortunately, sometimes we can come across documentation that will tell us who these people are. So let's read a little bit about the gentleman on the screen in front of you. George I, and this image was created by Godfrey Kneller circa 680 AD. George I by Godfrey Kneller circa 1680 AD. All right. So let's read about him. Quote, George III, meaning King George III of Europa. George III was in height about 5 feet 10 inches and a half and of a robust person. In his youth, he was considered handsome, but his face and eyes were too prominent. His lips thick, his mouth wide and large. His face was of a deep copper color. And the source that I'm getting that from is John Brown, quote, Memoirs of George III, late King of Great Britain, 1820. So the source that I'm getting that from is John Brown's Memoirs of George III, late King of Great Britain, 1820. All right. So this document was created in 1820 by John Brown, called Memoirs of George III. And George III is described by having a deep copper color or a deep copper complexion. OK, just like this gentleman that you see on the screen in front of you. So that means that, the Georgian dynasty, those kings, those men, they would have looked similar to this man that you see on the screen in front of you. All right. So now let's continue what we're reading. All right. So now mind you, this information was put out in 1820. OK, so it goes on to say, quote, the 1828 Webster's Dictionary defines American as, quote, a native of America originally applied to the Aboriginals or copper-colored races. So we also want to make note that the melanated Europans and the Aboriginal Americans were described ethnically, and the phenotypes were described similar majority of the time. Both were described as a copper-colored people, a swarthy people, a Moorish people, a tawny people, and our women were described as brunettes. Okay. So also keep in mind that that term American, the original definition of an American, was originally applied to the Aboriginals or copper-colored races. So these are so-called black people that today we would call them so-called black people or so-called African Americans. All right. So this is why I said that when the melanated people from Europa came to the Americas and they would intermix with us, or they would just take on our culture and take on our way of dress and started to hang out with us, you really wouldn't be able to tell the difference, especially after a couple of generations. All right. So we are the sons and daughters of those people. George III was the same color as natives of America. Let me repeat that. George III was the same color, or his phenotype, as the natives of America. This portrait is now identified as a black gentleman in 18th century scarlet livery. A highly decorative oil on canvas of a so-called black gentleman in 18th century scarlet livery with a gold collar and fur-lined tassel cap, typical of the period. The combination of scarlet and gold was also associated with nobility, wealth, and prestige, just like you see this gentleman wearing. All right. Scarlet, a bright red color, was considered regal and symbolized power and authority. Gold, being a precious metal, represented wealth and opulence. Together, scarlet and gold created a striking and visually appealing combination that showcased the status and importance of individuals they represented. A single pearl earring signifies a noble or aristocratic lineage. It was worn by men from prominent families to showcase their wealth, high social status, refinement, and privileged background. This was painted by Godfrey Kneller circa 1680. So this gentleman that you see in front of you, who's wearing gold and he has on the scarlet colored coat, this painting was created in 1680 by a man named Godfrey Kneller. Godfrey Kneller was the leading portrait painter in England during the late 17th and 18th centuries. Godfrey Kneller was the leading portrait painter in England during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, and was court painter to English and British monarchs from Charles II to George I. George I was King of Britain and Ireland from August 1st, 1714, and ruled of the Duchy and Electorate of Brunswick, Lunenburg, or Hanover, within the Holy Roman Empire from January 23rd, 1698, until his death in 1727. He was the first British monarch of the House of Hanover. All right. So that's the individual that you see on the screen in front of you. And I just wanted to go over some information so we'll understand a little bit about, who we're looking at, describe the painting, who painted this, what year it was created, and how did they describe this gentleman. And they described him as being a swarthy man. All right. Once again, ethnic terms to describe phenotypes of so-called ancient or medieval black people. Okay. So now what we will do is take our attention and we're going to talk a little bit about how did these people in Europa fall? All right. As I said, there was already a lot of infighting, melanated people fighting against each other. So let's get a little bit more detail on that. The Age of Revolution is the period from approximately 1774 to 1849 in which a number of significant revolutionary movements occurred in most of Europe. The period is noted for the change from absolutist monarchies, so-called black European rulership, to representative governments with a written constitution and the creation of nation states. The revolutions were essentially bourgeoisie revolutions and democratic and liberal in nature, with the aim of removing the old so-called black monarchical system or structures and creating independent nation states. The outbreak of the revolutions in Europe provided the opportunity for liberals to expel so-called black European monarchs from their respective countries. Scrolling down. The scramble for Africa, also called the partition of Africa or the conquest of Africa, was the invasion, occupation, division, and colonization of African territory by so-called black European powers during a short period known to historians as the New Imperialism between 1881 and 1914. This is very important. New Imperialism categorizes a period of colonial expansion by Western so-called black European powers during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The period featured an unprecedented pursuit of overseas territorial acquisitions by so-called black European monarchs facing exile in their respective countries. The Age of Revolution 1848 precipitated the scramble for Africa, which was the exiling of the last so-called black European monarchs to their respective colonies in Africa. The question has been asked, considering most of Africa was colonized by Europe, why are white people so few on the continent? Well, because it wasn't so-called white people that colonized Africa. The so-called black British began colonizing Uganda in the 1880s. The British Protectorate of Uganda was a protectorate of the British Empire from 1894 to 1962. After the First World War by 1919, the so-called black British population of Uganda was estimated at 9,000 settlers. So we're going to go from the top down and analyze this. So the first thing that we want to know is that in Europe you had the Age of Revolution, which started around 1774 to 1849. And that during this period, the absolutist monarch system of the original medieval black European rulers, or what they call the black nobility, was changed to representative governments with a written constitution and the creation of nation states. So when you hear about, for example, the French Revolution, you had black European families that were ruling, Marie Antoinette and the house and Louis. And these were melanated, swarthy people like this gentleman you see on the screen. And for hundreds and hundreds of years, over 1,000 years, as a matter of fact, Europe was being ruled by these melanated families. And this is how power was consolidated. It was consolidated amongst these aristocratic families who ruled in absolute rulership. And the people that they ruled over were other melanated people and the Caucasian serfs that lived on this land. All right. So when you had a lot of the black nobility monarchs starting to fall, this is where you start to get the creation of what we call independent secular nation states. All right. So this whole idea of, these liberal movements to create these democratic revolutions in these democratic states, this was actually created by certain people that were melanated in Europe that wanted to take power from other monarchical families that maybe they either were jealous of or they were in rivalry with. So what they would do is you would have these melanated people and they would finance like the peasant revolts. So you would have these Caucasian Slavs who were being treated very, very harsh and poorly by some of these so-called black European rulers or the swarthy Moorish rulers of Europe. So you would have other swarthy people that would say, look, well, we want to take down these other melanated people. So what we're going to do is we're going to finance a war or finance conflict and get behind these Caucasian pale Slavic people. And we're going to send them in to sack these other melanated European nations or kingdoms. And once it's sacked, we're going to create these new independent nation states and put these Caucasian people in rulership. But we really are the ones ruling behind them. So it was like I say, they were ruling in proxy. OK, so this is where you start to have melanated people starting to empower Caucasian people by financing them to fight against other melanated people in Europe to take their land and resource. And then they would allow them to live on that land and to pay them a tax for living on that land because they supported them. OK, let's continue. So it says the revolutions were essentially democratic and liberal in nature. And the aim was to remove old so-called black monarch structures and create independent nation states. So that's where you get these, liberal movements, for example, like how they talk about the so-called Illuminati or the Sabbatean Frankists of Eastern Europe or Europe. They started to finance a lot of these revolutions to gain power because at this time there wasn't really secularism. And when I say secularism, meaning that in the ancient world, people usually, especially in Christendom, they would acknowledge the higher power or God Almighty as being the true sovereign of the land. All right. So that's how a lot of these Christian kings ruled. Although they may have been a king, but they did acknowledge that God Almighty is the true king and ruled over the entire land. And that's what the system was for quite a while. OK, so what ended up happening is you had a lot of satanic atheist melanated people who said, well, look, we want to create a system where it actually isn't under the rule of God Almighty. And we're going to do this through secularism. And we're going to use these revolutions to pump that and create that type of a system. And that's exactly what they did. OK, it goes on to say that the outbreak of the revolutions in Europe provided the opportunity for liberals to expel so-called black European monarchs from their respective countries. So like, for example, when you had the French Revolution and Marie and Louis were beheaded, those other melanated monarchs and aristocrats and nobles that were living and were part of that court, a lot of them were kicked out of Europe at this time. This happened in Southern Europe and the Iberian Peninsula. This happened in France. And this also happened in what we call today the United Kingdom. So you're starting to have all these melanated people that are from the upper class and from the middle class. A lot of them were denationalized and some of them were forced into prison. And they were sent over to the Americas, or some of them came to the Americas to try to get away from that and create a new life. All right. So this is where you had that mass influx of people from Europa who were melanated coming to the Americas and setting up what we would eventually call the 13 colonies. Because you had these revolutions in Europe where these Caucasian people were starting to be propped up by some of these atheistic melanated families. And, you know, a lot of the original inhabitants and settlers of Europa, they got kicked out. The original Iberians, they started to come to the Americas, okay? So that's actually how the Caucasian people started to come into prominence. They were being financed by these atheist, satanic, luciferic, revolutionary, liberal, you know, melanated families that wanted to get power. And in order for them to do that, they had to topple the thrones of a lot of these monarchs that were ruling, okay? So they would put these proxy leaders in, or these vassal kings in, that were actually Caucasian, but they were answering to melanated people behind closed doors, all right? Don't be surprised if that same system still exists to this day. Let's keep going. It goes on to say that the scramble for Africa was the invasion, occupation, division, and colonization of African territory by so-called black European powers between the short period known to historians as New Imperialism. Between 1881 and 1914, New Imperialism characterizes a period of colonial expansion by Western so-called black European powers during the late 19th and early 20th century. The period featured an unprecedented pursuit of overseas territorial acquisitions by so-called black European monarchs facing exile in their respective countries. So this is why they started to colonize certain parts of Africa. And believe it or not, those that were aggressive and brutal, they started to try to colonize certain parts of America, because they were being kicked out and they lost their territorial power from those revolutions that were happening in Europe. So what you got to understand is that the original European colonists of Africa were so-called black people. They were a Shemitic people coming from Europe, came into Africa, but they were coming from either Britain or Portugal or Spain, and they were colonizing those Hamitic people in Africa. Okay? So that is the first thing that we must understand. So, for example, in the movie Shaka Zulu, that is a false historical depiction when you show the Caucasian British coming in to colonize those Zulu inhabitants of Africa, okay? They actually originally were a melanated people coming from like Scotland or wherever it was that they were coming from, okay? So a lot of these swarthy Europeans, you know, they were pissed off because they lost power in Europe. So they're trying to now expand and go into other melanated people's territory and steal land from them and then put them in perpetual servitude. And some of them tried to do that here in the Americas. Okay. So to get ready to end the video, that's what the whole age of revolution was. And this is why you actually don't see that many Caucasian people in the continent of so-called Africa, because they were not the Europeans that were colonizing it. So you have right now people in the continent of so-called Africa that are full-blooded melanated people, but they have ancestry that goes back to the black Europeans that started to come there in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And some of them may not even know this. Okay. So keep that in mind, that you had swarthy people of Europa who were kicked out because of these revolutions, fighting against other melanated people that were starting to raise up Caucasian serfs to work on their behalf to steal land. And when they kicked out those melanated, you know, aristocrats, they started to go to other territories, places in the Mediterranean, Northwest Africa, and then eventually the Americas. Okay. So this is, you know what I'm saying, just some history, you know, that we putting out and trying to clean up so we can provide the people a little bit more understanding. But that is the answer to the question of, if Africa was colonized by so-called Europe, why aren't white people on the continent as much? And the reason why is because the original people that colonized Africa were melanated people from Europe. All right. So it's your boy Blackbeard. Y'all stay tuned for the next one. We out.